You've spent hours researching and picking out the best parts for your new gaming PC, waited patiently for all the components to arrive. But what next? How do you actually put your new gaming PC build together? Well, in this video, I'll be showing you exactly how to build a PC right now, regardless of the exact components you've selected. From the basics like installing the CPU, memory, and SSD, to more complex tasks like fitting an all-in-one liquid cooler and wiring up all of your cables. In this video, I'll be covering everything, even the Windows installation process, drivers, and BIOS settings you should use at the end to get gaming. So without any further ado, should we make a start? Today's video has been made possible by Intel Gamer Days. Their biggest sale of the year is here, with discounts on CPUs, GPUs, and even gaming laptops. Why not harness the power of Intel Arc graphics with Xe super sampling for AI enhanced upscaling and built-in AV1 encoders for video editing and content creation? Plus, with the purchase of a new 13th or 14th gen CPU, GPU, or laptop, you also get a free code for Assassin's Creed Shadows launching this November. Check it out at the first link in the description below. I've carefully selected demo parts for this build that are going to show you guys how to assemble any system, irrespective of the CPU, GPU, or motherboard brand you pick. And when it comes to cooling, I'll be showing you not only how to install an AIO, but how to install an air-cooled solution too. Now, with any build, the first thing you want is a clean workspace. You need a desk with plenty of room that you can keep everything nice and tidy. You're also going to need a few basic tools. These range from a standard Phillips head screwdriver to a smaller, teeny tiny screwdriver. At least that's what we call it on the channel, basically just a screwdriver with a smaller crosshead. You'd also want to use a pair of scissors, generally handy to have, as well as a pair of pliers. These can be useful if you get any screws threaded, need to take any motherboard standoffs out. Really makes the whole build that bit easier. And of course, don't forget the spirit level, because every DIY, no, I'm just kidding, you don't put the spirit level away. You don't need it. These tools are going to be more than sufficient for the vast majority of builds, and where there may be one or two extra bits you need along the way, I'm going to talk about and describe those to you as we go. Now, you can build a system in various different orders. Some people would recommend that you build basically the whole PC onto the motherboard at the start, before getting the build into the case. Back when there used to be more problems generally with PC components, people would do this as it was easier to debug and find out what's going on. And if you're doing a custom loop water-cooled build, that's a great idea. For a standard all-in-one build or a build using an air cooler, we can skip this step and build straight into the chassis. The likelihood any of your hardware is defective is going to be very low, and while there is a possibility, I've only had it happen once to one component in more than 100 builds over the last 10 years. That gives you an idea of the likelihood something's going to go wrong. Now, the motherboard though is the best place to start, and the reason for this is that it's the place you can tick off as many components as possible. Every gaming PC is made up of a few key parts: the CPU or processor, a cooler for said CPU, be it the stock unit or an aftermarket air or liquid option, a motherboard, which is what everything's going to install onto, RAM, standing for random access memory, some form of storage, typically an NVMe SSD drive in a gaming build right now, as well as a case to house your components, and a power supply to give everything, well, power. And I'll be looking at cables and wiring in detail a little bit later. Now, the motherboard allows us to tick off a few of those parts: the CPU cooler, or at least the prep for the cooler, the memory, and the SSD. That's basically 5 components in one go, which is, well, half of the build really. So should we get started? Now, when it comes to opening and unboxing the motherboard, it's going to come packaged a little something like this. Now, for today's video, I'll be using this Asus Z790 board. It's a standard ATX size motherboard as my example. Again, this is about as standard as it gets and gives you an idea of, regardless what motherboard you're using, how to actually assemble the system. Now, first things first, take it out the anti-static bag and pop this later on back into the motherboard box. You don't want to install the build on the bag. The outer coating of the anti-static bag is actually static, believe it or not. That's where the static goes. So building on top of said bag is not a good idea. Now, if your motherboard's got some form of protective foam on the bottom, you can leave this on. This is just going to protect any connections poking through the rear. So I'm going to leave that on. If you haven't got one, it's honestly no stress. There's a few key areas on the motherboard I should point out. The CPU socket is the first. This is where we'll be installing the processor. The RAM DIMM's a second, where we'll be installing the memory. And then the NVMe slots. Now, on most boards, especially those that are higher end, these are covered with heat sinks. On cheaper boards, you may see exposed M.2 slots as well, which is totally normal. This here is our PCI X16 slot, the top largest PCI slot, which is where you'll be installing the graphics card, where you'll also see various different power connections on the motherboard you should consider. Now, the main ones to think about are the CPU power up in the top corner, the motherboard power on the right-hand side of the motherboard, as well as any fan headers. These are the 4-pin headers on the top, side, and bottom. Now, regardless of the motherboard you pick, they're all going to be in approximately the same locations. You're going to be good. The final thing to cover with the motherboard is the rear I/O. This is where all of the rear connectivity is, and you can see on this board, you've got the Wi-Fi antennas, we've got audio just before that, as well as Ethernet, high-speed USB, and then any display connections too. Now, a quick note on display connections: if you're using a CPU that has got integrated graphics, like the chip I'll be using for today's demo, you can use the graphics ports at the back. But if your chip has integrated graphics and you're using a GPU, or just doesn't have them at all, you want to use the display connections on the back of your graphics card. That applies to pretty much everybody wanting to build a gaming PC. For this demo, I'll be using an Intel CPU, but regardless again of the chip you use, the same rules apply. And if you're watching this video when it launches, Intel Gamer Days is happening, well, right now, and you can learn more about that at the links in the description below. Now, as far as CPU installation goes, the whole thing is actually pretty easy. First things first, you want to locate the triangle on the corner of the CPU. This is often easier to see from the front, and you can see on our i7 chip, it's just here. This is going to match up with a triangle on the socket, and you can see the triangle is located in the bottom left on our motherboard today. Different motherboards may have it in different places, but typically it's in the same location. Lift up the socket by pushing the arm down and out and lifting the lid, well, of the CPU socket. Then you want to drop the CPU in, lining the triangle for the orientation. Be careful of the pins on the socket, and what you can do is give it a little bit of a wiggle. Now, there's a very, very small amount of movement in the CPU, which you can see if we zoom right in, before then pushing the socket cover down. The black plastic may pop off, and adding the arm in. A bit of pressure and a bit of tension, but you don't need to force it. Congratulations, you've just installed your first PC component. And spoiler alert, that's one of the easiest to get wrong, really. So if you've done this okay, we're off to a great start. Next up is memory or RAM. Now, on this board, you'll see there are a number of memory DIMM slots. 1, 2, 3, and 4 to be precise. Now, rather confusingly, RAM DIMM slots actually start from 0. So we count 0, 1, 2, 3. If you've got 1 DIMM of memory, the likelihood is you'll want to place this in the second slot. If you've got 2 DIMMs, you'll want to place it in the second and fourth, and if you've got 4 DIMMs, you'll want to occupy, well, all of them. For this build, I'm going to be using 2 DIMMs. I've just picked up this Apacer Panther DDR5 kit. Now, the only thing to note with memory is just where the notch is on the center of the slot, allowing you to easily identify where the RAM goes. Pull back the second and fourth clips if you've got 2 DIMMs, line up the notch with that of the slot, and then slide the memory into place. Bit of pressure on both sides, and the RAM is going to click in. You want to make sure you get that nice satisfying click sound, as that shows that it is seated. I don't recommend putting excess pressure, but you should be able to gently lift the motherboard up by each RAM DIMM. And if it's not quite seated correctly, well, this will happen. And that shows you that the memory's not clicked in, so try again, and just make sure the clip on one or both sides makes that satisfying click sound. CPU and memory are in. We're going to do our storage next up. Now, for different builds, you will have different M.2 configurations. And to show you what I mean by this, I can unscrew the very top heatsink here with my teeny tiny screwdriver, which will reveal an M.2 slot I can install into. And similarly, if I go ahead and unscrew the ones at the bottom, you'll see that I uncover even more slots. In fact, here, there are actually 2 additional slots I can use. Now, the bandwidth for these comes from different places. So if you've got 3 or 4 drives you're installing, you will want to consider the manual. I'll keep it simple. If you've got 1 NVMe drive you're installing for now, all you need to do is use the top slot. Don't worry about the rest. You can keep these nicely covered up. On here is a thermal pad. I'm actually going to go ahead and remove the protective plastic for this thermal pad now, so that I don't forget, and do the same for the rest of the NVMe slot too. This is just going to allow the SSD to receive better cooling. You might want to dislodge it with a screwdriver before pulling this up. I'm going to be using Samsung's 990 Pro for this demo, before sliding the drive in at a 45-degree angle. Push it in like so, place it down, and then you'll notice there's this little plastic toolless notch. Spin this round to secure the drive in. Some builds will have a standard screw installation, so you can find some footage on your screen now of what that looks like if your build is a little bit more basic. Then you're going to want to go ahead and return the M.2 heatsink back into place. Get it lined up around the appropriate screw holes. A few turns of your small screwdriver on each just to get the drive nice and secure, and the whole installation is complete. And we're also going to have much improved cooling for the NVMe 2, which, believe it or not, can run quite hot. Now that nearly rounds off the motherboard assembly. We've ticked off the CPU, memory, SSD, and, well, the motherboard. However, you may want to go ahead and proceed with more of your build at this stage. For example, the cooler is is one area where you can make preparations. And for this demo, I'll be using Montec's Hyperflow ARGB360. But this is representative of most liquid coolers on the market. Now, typically, a CPU cooler, be it air or liquid, is comprised of a few key elements. A backplate, an area where the heat dissipation will occur. So in a liquid cooler, that's going to be in the actual radiator where the fans are. In an air cooler, that's going to be the tower heatsink, that's the small metal fins. And you're also going to have some form of heat transfer. The heat transfer being the bit the actual heat travels through between the CPU and being cooled. Now in a liquid cooler, that's going to be through the liquid that flows through the tubes. Yes, this does come pre-filled, so there's no DIY element involved. While in an air cooler, that's going to come in the form of heat pipes, which transfer the heat from the CPU through the fins of the heatsink. Now, you may find with most coolers, especially those that are brand new, that you're buying box fresh, shall we say, that the thermal paste comes pre-applied. Now, leave the plastic protector on for now, as getting this on your clothes is a bad time. Take that from someone who builds a lot of gaming computers. This Montec cooler has the fans already pre-installed. Great work, Montec, and I'll link this and everything else mentioned today down below if you do fancy checking any of it out. However, some coolers don't. Some coolers will require you to install these fans yourself. It's a pretty easy thing to do. Take the fan, place it on, and have the long screws through each corner. I would highly recommend checking out the manual for the CPU cooler, and this one from Montec is actually a really fantastic example of something that's clear and easy to follow. The manual might seem overwhelming, but there will be an Intel and an AMD section, and depending on the socket your CPU uses, depends largely on the installation method you'll be using. Now, looking at the manual, and you can see the Intel LGA process is really simple. Backplate, screws, frame, cooler. Really nice and easy. Take your bag of mounting hardware and locate the various bits that it requires you to use. In our instance, it's going to be the Intel LGA backplate. Looking at this, we've got one for LGA 1700, which is what the 12th, 13th, and 14th gen processors use, and one for LGA 115X. Now, that's going to be what your older chips use, your pre-12th gen processors. Inside this bag, you'll also find some more standoffs, which are going to be labeled with the LGA 1700 designation. Let's see if we can locate those. Yes, we can. You can see here, LGA 1700, as well as a collection of thumb screws. Now, these are handily bundled in with other hardware we don't need. Thanks, Montec. But you don't need to use all of this. In fact, if you're trying to use all of your CPU cooler mounting hardware, probably doing something a little bit wrong. Go ahead and place the backplate on the rear of the motherboard, place the motherboard back onto the motherboard box, and add each of the standoffs in. Air coolers typically have a similar installation method, some form of backplate, but they often screw directly into the backplate rather than requiring extra standoff. Consult the manual for your air or liquid cooler just to be safe. The rest of the cooler installation is going to wait until the motherboard has been moved into the case, but it's very often worth installing the full air cooler and the prep for the liquid cooler in pretty much any build that you assemble at the moment. Now, with the motherboard assembly all complete and the CPU cooler familiarized with, shall we say, next up is the case. Now, for this build, I've gone ahead and picked one of the most popular cases on the market right now. This comes in from Fantex and is again very representative of what you'll find in a standard ATX build. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull off the rear side panel as well as removing the glass panel too. Now, what that's going to do is give me easier access to the internal components of the system and make the next bit of the build easier. Every case that you build with is going to include either an accessory box or an accessory bag. In here, you'll find all the screws and associated paraphernalia that you need to actually get your build going. Now, you can see here, I think I've used this before, so the screws are, well, a little disorganized, but there will be screws included for SSD, hard drive installation, motherboard installation, and the installation of the power supply a little bit later too. Inside any case, you'll find a number of standoffs, and these are what the motherboard is going to stand on top of. You can't screw the motherboard down directly to the tray, as A, nothing will line up, and B, the motherboard will ground out against the case. Basically, it's bad news and you don't want that to happen. To show you the standoffs, I'm going to use my special close-up camera, which will better highlight where these live. Now, these standoffs live inside the case, and you can see here there are a number of different standoffs at play. Typically, you'll have 3 standoffs at the top of the case. You'll also have 3 standoffs along the middle. You can see the very, very center one is actually slightly raised in the middle. And then for an ATX config, a further 3 at the bottom. Now, this has been used for a micro ATX build before, so you can see that a couple of the standoffs are actually in the wrong locations. These are going to need to be removed and relocated. For this, you can either use the pliers we used earlier, or locate locate this included standoff removal tool, which you'll find in pretty much all chassis nowadays. Go ahead and locate the standoffs to the appropriate places. If you're confused about where these should be, they've got to match up perfectly with the holes on your motherboard. So this board's got 3 at the top, 3 along the middle, and then a further 3 down the bottom just here. These need to line up perfectly for the motherboard to sit in the right place. Things then are starting to look a little bit more complete. And at this stage, we could do the CPU cooler and get that finished. If you've got an air cooler, you're already going to be there. And similarly, we could also go ahead and put the GPU in, but I'm going to recommend you do neither. If you can, I would recommend at this stage doing as much of the cable and wiring as possible. And that of course means installing the power supply. Now the world of power supplies is a little bit complicated, and we have compiled some separate guides on how to pick the best power supply for different budgets and wattages, which I'll leave linked in the description and in the card section now. Now, when it comes to power supplies, there are a few different kinds. There are semi-modular, fully modular, and non-modular units. Non-modular is the easiest, cheapest, and most basic. Basically, any cable you need plugged in, but you won't need all of them. Semi-modular plugs in things like the CPU and motherboard power cable, letting you choose what GPU and SATA power you require, while this fully modular unit means you only plug in the cables you actually need. Now, I'm going to talk you through what cables you probably need and how to figure out which ones you may need to add in addition as we go. Power supplies first, you can see here, pretty standard unit. You've got the fan, which is going to pull air into the power supply rather than exhausting out. You've got the rear kettle lead connection, which is where your external wall power comes from. A switch, which you definitely want to remember to turn on before booting. One of the biggest mistakes people make is they get the system built and then it won't boot, and that's often why. As well as the fully modular cable interface on the rear, which is where you'll be plugging in any CPU or graphics card cables, motherboard connections, the new PCI Gen 5 standard, and then any SATA or Molex cables which go down the bottom just here. Now inside the box you'll also find a large collection of fully modular cables. Now let's start off with the cables that you're definitely going to need. Every single gaming PC build is going to need to use one of these. This is an ATX 24-pin motherboard power connector. So go ahead, the large single block is going to go to the motherboard, while the split block will plug into the power supply. I'll put that to one side for now. Next up is your GPU power. Now this runs in 2 formats. This ASRock Intel Arc A770 is going to use a 6+2 pin PCI power, meaning this, which is the fancy new 16-pin Gen 5 standard, won't be required for this particular build. I'm going to put this in a separate pile. What will be required for this build though is a 6+2 pin PCI power connector. In fact, I believe we're going to need 2, so let's find one and then also locate a second in this pile, of which there will be another one somewhere. This one actually has 2 on, so that's going to be fine for this build and save us from needing to use the single individual connection. While you're also going to need to add in a CPU power cable. Now these are 4+4 pins, look a little something like this, and often you'll have to plug in 2 to your build. It all depends on how many connections are at the top of the motherboard. Go ahead and put this in the pile of cables to install as well. It happens that this build does require 2 sets of 8 pins, so I'm going to get a second cable and add that to the pile too. You may also need to install a SATA power connection. This is going to power up any SATA hard drives, SSDs, and even things like RGB controllers. Very often, if you've got extra peripherals and accessories, they'll use this standard as it's the lowest power and easiest to integrate. Put that in the pile. Take the cables that you don't need and put these back in the power supply box and keep it safe because you may need to upgrade the system later and these cables are going to come in very, very handy. Then it's a simple case of plugging up all the cables to the places that they fit. Generally, if the cable splits, you want to double check which end goes to the power supply and the motherboard. It is labeled on these. These cables actually have the letters PSU on the ends which go to the power supply, and that's all the cables nicely connected. Once all of the cables are in, it's then a case of spinning the PC case around and locating where the power supply installs. Now in this build, it's at the rear section just here. Now there is something important to note, and that's to do with the fan. Now this fan requires airflow. It's going to intake air. Now this case has mesh on the bottom and a dust filter, meaning that a fan down orientation makes sense. However, if you're putting the case on carpet, you may want to just check the clearance. Some cases allow you to install fan up by having mesh ventilation on the power supply shield. This case doesn't, so fan down is the only option. Just make sure there is sufficient airflow underneath the PC and that the power supply isn't going to be starved of air. Slide it in, a little something like so, and then secure 4 power supply screws through the rear. These are larger than what you're likely to have used when it comes to installing the motherboard. Once the power supply cables are in, it's then time to get things wired up. And let's start with power cables. CPU power is the first, and this goes up to the top left-hand side of the motherboard above the processor. processor. Motherboard power is second. This is the largest and goes to the right-hand side of the motherboard, to the right of the memory or RAM DIMM slots. Work through the cable management as you go and leverage any built-in cable routing systems at the back of the case to keep things nice and tidy. Front panel cables are next, and these are what power up the I/O on the top of your case. JFP1 are the fiddliest. These can be small pins or a single block, and they go to the bottom right of the motherboard. I'll put a diagram on screen now that hopefully makes this a little easier to follow. USB 3 comes in two formats, Type A and Type C. USB Type C is not going to be present in this build, but again, I'll pop some B-roll of this going in an equivalent system to show you how it's done, while USB 3 standard is larger and notched, so only goes in one way around. HD audio is fairly similar, and that goes to the bottom left of the case. There are one or two more things you might want to wire up at this point too. Any fan headers, these tend to be 4-pin and plug up either to the top, side or bottom of the board, depending on where the cables are running from, as well as any ARGB headers, which are going to plug up again to the motherboard. These control things like the RGB fans on the front of this Fantex case. Now then, with all that sorted and our cable and wiring pretty much done, it's going to make things like the CPU cooler installation that bit easier and prevent this from getting in the way of any of the ports we might need to access. Now in this build, I've opted for a 360mm rad, and given the case's pretty strong compatibility, I'm going to mount this at the top of the chassis. And now to do this, you get a number of screws included with the CPU cooler, which will fasten it through these rails at the top of the case. Simply go ahead and line the cooler up, install the radiator first, and then it's a simple case of popping the CPU block onto those 4 posts I installed earlier. The thermal paste is pre-installed, saving a job, while the thumb screws that come included can be tensioned with the screwdriver to make sure the block doesn't go anywhere. That's going to keep the i7-14700K in this particular build nice and cool, or of course whatever CPU you choose to go for your next gaming PC build. The final part then to install is the GPU. Now this is the ASRock Intel Arc A770, and like the CPU earlier, it's included in Intel's Gamer Day deals, which you can learn more about at the first links in the description below. Now this card right here is going to be a good fit for the build today, and is a great representation of what a typical GPU is going to look like. Now this ASRock card's a particularly nice design. It's on the larger side, so again that's going to show us what we can expect from some of those bigger, beefier GPUs out there. And although this video is not intended to be a compatibility guide, it's a great time to point out that if you haven't already, you should check that your GPU clearance in your case is greater than the GPU clearance that your GPU requires based on its length. Bear in mind as well, any radiators you put in at the front are going to reduce that clearance. So if you're needing to calculate these things, make sure you take those key variables into account. Now, I'm going to peel off all the plastic, not only because it's going to look better, but actually leaving this plastic on is not a good idea. You know, thin plastic film and heat are not a particularly good combo, so get this removed, we don't want any problems. And then line up the GPU with where you're going to install it in the case. Now for me, I'm going to hover over the top PCI slot, and that's going to show me roughly whereabouts this system is going to lie. Now at the back of the case, you'll find a number of PCI lane covers. In this build, I need to remove the second and third, as that is where the rear I/O of the GPU is going to poke through. Now very often these are thumb screws, but I often find it easier to employ the use of a screwdriver, and you can see if I just go ahead and unscrew this one here, as well as the one below it, I'll then be able to slide the graphics card into place. Now, you're going to want to give it a bit of pressure until you hear a click sound like the RAM DIMM. And the graphics card should have a little bit of wobble, but should generally sit okay. The thumb screws are going to solve the wobble problem and secure the card in, and those PCI lanes removed, you can keep safe should you ever decide to take the graphics card out, sell the case, and you want to actually ship it out with those lane covers, or just, I don't know, need them for whatever reason in the future. So secure the card down. Can be a good idea to hold the card up while you secure it to try and minimize GPU sag, and then a simple case of wiring up the power for the graphics card. You can see 2 8-pins, so 2 6+2 pins in this build, which I ran earlier on. Get this powered up and everything should be nicely complete. With the build nicely assembled and looking good, the next step is arguably as important as the build process itself, and that's getting everything correctly configured, from all your BIOS settings to your drivers and Windows installation. Now I'm going to start things off with the Windows installation, and for this you're going to need yourself a USB drive. Simply download the online tool from Microsoft that allows you to create bootable media, chuck it on a USB on a separate PC, and then plug this in into one of the USB ports on the back of the motherboard. Make sure it's USB 3 as that's going to make the Windows installation process a bit more speedy. Get yourself a monitor, keyboard and mouse, and then turn the PC on. Immediately start hitting the delete key on the keyboard. And what this is going to do is basically say to the PC, please go into the BIOS because I'd like to configure some settings. Now, if I keep hitting delete, hopefully it will spin into action. The first boot can be longer than the subsequent boots. It's doing things like memory training. It's going, yes, hello, I'm a graphics card, and then eventually it will do this. I'm going to hit F1 to jump into the BIOS and jump into setup. And once I get into the BIOS, I can check all of my key information is correct. So yes, my SSD is indeed the Samsung 990 Pro, and I have two 16GB DIMMs of DDR5 memory. I can also check my 14700K looks to be all right, and you can see information such as temperature data, good to see. Now immediately to me, this looks a little bit high, which perhaps indicates there's a problem with my cabling and wiring. 88 seems a very, very high temperature for a build that, let's face it, isn't actually doing a great deal. When you're in the BIOS, you can shut the PC down without any issues, just hit the power button. It looks like the pump cable had become disconnected when the rear side panel went off. So I've fixed that and I'm going to leave the rear side panel off for now, just to be safe. Then I'll tidy up the cable management and just double check those temperatures look all good. Going back to the first step and hitting delete again, always a great idea to check these core vitals in the BIOS when you get started. Already that's made a massive difference to CPU temps, down to 40, sub 40 degrees, so everything is good on that front. Now then, it looks like I've got my NVMe drive good and a USB flash drive showing in storage. I'm going to hit F7 to jump into advanced mode, go to boot, and then use the boot override option to set the flash drive as my initial drive of choice. Now, clicking into that is going to push us straight through into the USB. It will take a moment, and that should put us in the Windows installation mode. If you're wondering why I've not messed with any sort of CPU or memory settings yet, that's because I want to install Windows first while everything is super reliable, there's no XMP at play, and I'll do any BIOS tweaking that is needed afterwards. The main thing is just checking all your cooling is working okay, which it now looks to be. The Windows installation tool is really self-explanatory. Simply choose your language, click install, enter a product key if you've got one. You can proceed without and activate later on. Then you're going to choose your Windows version. I'm going to go Windows 11 Home, before then agreeing to the Microsoft terms and conditions, choosing install Windows only and selecting the drive which you want to install Windows on. If you've got multiple drives and you aren't sure which one is which, and you have a specific drive you'd like to install Windows on, you can actually turn the PC off, take the other drives out and add them back in later. That will give you one drive in this menu to choose from, as I've got in today's build. Then it's a simple case of waiting for Windows to run through all of the steps. This can take anywhere from about 5 or 10 minutes through to about half an hour, depending on the speed of your drive, speed of the USB, speed of the port you've plugged into. There's lots of factors at play. But as long as those percentages are moving on up, you're not going to have a problem. Now, Windows seems to have completed and the whole thing has restarted, and we're still getting a particular error: CPU fan speed detection. Now, this is really common, and I see people slip up on this all the time. So let's amend this before jumping into Windows. Now, this is because the cooler that I've gone for, while the AIO is plugged into the AIO pump header, the actual fans are not plugged into the CPU fan header. This is common on coolers that you may control through software or a USB interface. Now, to fix this, I'm actually going to go into advanced mode via F7, go over to monitor, and then work down to fan speed monitor. CPU fan speed, I'm going to set to ignore. That should solve the problem. And at this stage, I'm also going to pull out the Windows bootable media. That's going to stop the build from moving through to the Windows installation again. Then go to boot and ensure that the boot option number 1 is set to Windows Boot Manager. Fantastic. And hit F10 to save and exit. Hit enter, and that's going to chew us straight through into Windows, or at least that's the hope. There's still going to be a little bit of the installation left to complete here, so you may have to be a little bit patient while Windows runs through all of the various settings it requires. Now, eventually you will get through to this step, which is going to say, let's connect you to a network. Now, there are two problems with this. The first is that you may not have any Wi-Fi or Ethernet drivers yet, so it may physically be impossible to do so. The second is that by doing so, it's going to want us to do OneDrive, log in with the Microsoft account, but there is a solution. Now, the solution, as I have it written down, is to hit Shift and F10 on your keyboard. That's going to bring up the command prompt. You're then going to type in the following: OOBE /bypass NRO, all capital letters. Hit enter. Now, what that is going to do is ping you back a few steps in the Windows installation process, and it may ask you to go through the language and the keyboard settings once again, but do this and you won't be then required to do the networking stage, which is a win in my book. Carry on through all of the final instructions until you land into the Windows 11 desktop environment. And we are in. Now, there are a few drivers and bits and pieces that we'll want to do next, but I am going to go ahead and enable XMP on the memory first, now that Windows has been installed. If you jump into Task Manager, you can check everything looks okay. We've got the i7 there looking fine, and then the memory, as you can see, is only running at 4800 megahertz. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut the system down, wait for it to turn off, and then boot again into the BIOS to adjust those XMP settings.
3 days later.
Enabling this is really easy. Simply move over to the XMP field here and click Enabled. It's then going to pick up the preset for the memory. This is DDR5 6000. I'm going to hit F10 to save and exit. There are other BIOS settings you may want to adjust as well, but I'd recommend, as tiring and arduous as it might be, to do one at a time. Then if one of the settings changes causes an issue, you know which one it is, rather than trying to guess which setting you changed caused some sort of conflict. Once an XMP has been enabled, it can take a little while for the system to get that memory trained up, and you'll want to check this afterwards in Task Manager within Windows to make sure the correct XMP speed has been applied and that you're now running at the faster megahertz rating. Looking good. All that then remains is to install all of your drivers and utilities. What I would recommend you do is navigate to the Motherboard manufacturer's webpage. This is the Asus ROG Strix Z790, but of course your motherboard model will vary depending on the build that you've gone for. Download all of the drivers and utilities you see necessary. Chipset and networking are the big ones, and then you also want to navigate to the manufacturer's website for your GPU and download the GPU driver utility. Again, this will vary depending on what brand of graphics card you have. Work through all these steps when it comes to driver installation, and once you've done that, the system should be pretty much ready to go. There are a couple of other pieces of software that are worth shouting out at this stage. I like to use something like CPU-Z to stress the CPU load to 100% and check for any instability issues, while Firmark is a good way of stress testing the GPU. Hardware Monitor Pro, the free version, actually is great as well for monitoring all of your key credentials, checking things like CPU and GPU temperatures, clock speeds, and just giving you a little bit of an overview of how your system is doing. They're not applications you'll use every day, but when you've got a new PC, it can be nice to really burn it in and check that everything is working all right to avoid any potential surprises later on. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you build yourself a gaming PC, right from the very start through to the BIOS, drivers, software, and everything in between. What do you guys think? Are you guys ready for your next build? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this one, get subscribed. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you next time.